They say the hardest part of any divorce is figuring out what happens to the kids. But nobody ever talks about what happens when the split doesn't just tear the family in half, it rips it into jagged, unpredictable pieces. My husband, Luke, and I had been married for 12 years. We weren't perfect, who is, but we had built what I thought was a solid, dependable life. 2 kids, a mortgage, and Friday night pizza dinners where we all sat around the table laughing at my failed attempts to tell jokes. And then there was Dylan, Luke's best friend since college. Dylan had always been around, like a member of the family. He was the fun uncle to our kids, always bringing them silly toys or teaching them goofy tricks when he came over. He was charming, easygoing, and, I'll admit, dangerously good-looking. For years, I kept my thoughts about him buried where I thought they belonged. But then one day, I didn't. I'd love to say I don't know how it happened, but that's not true. I know exactly how it happened. It started with an innocent message on Facebook, a joke about one of those silly memes people post. One message turned into a flurry of late-night conversations. And then, one night when Luke was away on a business trip, Dylan came over to help fix a leaky faucet in the kitchen. One thing led to another, and suddenly, my carefully constructed life was hanging by a thread. For over a year, Dylan and I carried on our affair in secret. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a harmless escape. But I wasn't fooling anyone, least of all myself. And then, Luke found out. It wasn't some dramatic discovery, no lipstick on a collar or incriminating texts left open on my phone. Luke had been suspicious for a while, and one day, he decided to do something about it. He followed me to a coffee shop where Dylan and I were meeting. I'll never forget the look on his face when he walked in and saw us together. He didn't yell or make a scene. He just stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tight. "We're going home," he said, his voice low and steady. The drive back to the house was silent, the air between us thick with tension. When we finally got inside, he sat me down at the kitchen table. "I want the truth," he said, his voice shaking. "How long has this been going on?" I could have lied. I could have said it was a one-time thing, a moment of weakness. But the truth spilled out of me before I could stop it. A year. Luke's face went pale. He stood up and walked out of the room without another word. I didn't see him again until the next morning, when he told me he was moving into the guest room. For the next few weeks, we existed in a state of painful limbo. We barely spoke, only communicating when it was absolutely necessary. The kids, Emma and Jack, were confused and scared, but I didn't know how to explain what was happening. How do you tell your children that their mother betrayed their father? And then, one night, Luke dropped the bombshell. "I'm filing for divorce," he said, his voice flat. "But we need to talk about the kids." I nodded, my throat tight. I had known this was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a punch to the gut. "I want full custody," he continued. "What?" I stared at him, stunned. "You can't be serious. The kids need both of us." Luke's expression was unreadable. "They don't need someone who puts her own desires ahead of their family." His words cut me to the core, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We'll figure this out," I said, though I had no idea how. A week later, Dylan showed up at the house. Luke wasn't home, and the kids were at a friend's birthday party. "We need to talk," he said, standing in the doorway with a sheepish expression. I let him in, though my stomach was in knots. Things between us had been strained since Luke found out, and I wasn't sure what he wanted. "Luke came to see me," Dylan said, sinking onto the couch. My heart skipped a beat. "What did he say?" "He wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify against you in court." The room spun around me. "What?" Dylan nodded. "He said if I told the judge about the affair, it would strengthen his case for custody." I stared at him, my mind racing. "And what did you say?" I told him no. Dylan leaned forward, his expression serious. I don't want to hurt you, Caroline. And I don't want to hurt the kids. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. But it was quickly overshadowed by dread. If Luke was willing to go that far, what else was he planning? The custody battle began in earnest a few weeks later. Lawyers were hired, accusations were thrown, and every aspect of our lives was picked apart under a microscope. I thought it couldn't get any worse, until one day, Luke dropped another bombshell. He wasn't fighting for full custody because he thought I was an unfit mother. He was doing it because he thought Dylan might be Emma and Jack's biological father. Luke's accusation hit me like a freight train. I sat frozen in the lawyer's office, the words echoing in my head, Dylan might be their father. What did you just say? I finally managed to choke out. Luke leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but cold. You heard me. I'm not convinced Emma and Jack are mine. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Clara, raised an eyebrow but said nothing, clearly accustomed to moments like this. That's ridiculous, I said, my voice trembling. You're their father, Luke. You know that. Do I? He asked, his tone cutting. Because now I'm not so sure. As much as I wanted to dismiss Luke's claim, his words planted a seed of doubt in my mind. Dylan and I had been reckless during the affair. It wasn't impossible, just unthinkable. When I got home, I shut myself in the bathroom and pulled out the photo album we kept on the top shelf of the closet. Flipping through pictures of Emma and Jack, I searched for, what, exactly? A clue? A sign? Something to tell me that Luke's fears were baseless? Emma had Luke's dark hair, but her smile was softer, more like Dylan's. Jack had my green eyes but a dimple in his cheek I'd never seen in Luke's family. The more I looked, the less certain I felt. I couldn't keep the doubt to myself for long. That evening, I called Dylan and asked him to meet me at a park near the house. He arrived 20 minutes later, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by concern. What's going on? He asked as we sat on a bench under a street lamp. I took a deep breath. Luke, he thinks the kids might be yours. Dylan's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked like he might laugh. But when he saw the seriousness on my face, his expression shifted. Is that even possible? I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't think so. But you're not sure, Dylan finished for me. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. Caroline, if there's even a chance, we need to find out. I can't just ask them for a DNA test, I said, horrified by the thought. What would I tell them? How would I explain it? Dylan shook his head. We'll figure it out. But you need to know the truth. We both do. Over the next few days, I wrestled with what to do. I couldn't bear the thought of putting the kids through a test, so I did something I never thought I'd do, I swabbed Jack's toothbrush and sent the sample to a private lab. Dylan did the same with his own DNA. The waiting was unbearable. Every time Jack or Emma smiled at me, I felt like the worst mother in the world. How could I do this to them? How could I even entertain the idea that Luke wasn't their father? But the doubt wouldn't go away, and I knew I couldn't move forward until I had answers. 2 weeks later, the results arrived in my email. My hands trembled as I clicked the link, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The words on the screen blurred for a moment, but when I focused, the truth hit me like a lightning bolt. Dylan is not Jack's biological father. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. There was still Emma. I didn't have to wait long for the second set of results. When they came, I opened the email with equal parts dread and hope. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Emma's results were inconclusive. The lab report explained that while Dylan wasn't excluded as her biological father, the data suggested a possible mutation in her DNA, a rare anomaly that made the test difficult to interpret. They recommended additional testing to confirm. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. What did this mean? Was it just an error? Or was there something else, something I hadn't even considered? When I told Luke about the test results, he didn't react the way I expected. Instead of relief, there was something almost like disappointment in his eyes. "So, Jack's mine," he said slowly. "But Emma." "It doesn't mean anything," I said quickly. "It's just an anomaly. We can do another test if you want." Luke shook his head. "I don't need another test. I need you to be honest with me. Is there anyone else?" The question hit me like a slap. "What? Of course not. How could you even think that?" "Because this whole marriage has been a lie," Luke said bitterly. "So why should I believe you now?" His words stung, but I couldn't blame him. In his eyes, I had betrayed him not just once, but over and over again. Later that night, I called Dylan to tell him about the results. He listened quietly, then said something that sent a chill down my spine. "What if the mutation isn't an error?" he said. "What if Emma's condition has nothing to do with me, or Luke?" I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "There's something you're not considering," Dylan said. "If Emma's DNA is unusual, it might not be because of her father. It could be something else. Something genetic." Dylan's words planted another seed of doubt, but this one was different. It wasn't about infidelity or betrayal. It was about Emma herself. I started digging through family medical histories, searching for anything that might explain the anomaly. But what I found only deepened the mystery. There were no records of similar mutations in either Luke's or my family. Nothing that could explain what the lab had found. And then, one night while I was going through old paperwork, I found something I hadn't thought about in years: Emma's adoption papers. Emma wasn't biologically mine or Luke's. She was adopted. It was something we had never planned to keep a secret, but life had gotten busy, and the years had flown by. By the time Emma was old enough to ask questions, we had simply fallen into the habit of treating her adoption as a non-issue. But now, it was a very big issue. As I stared at the papers, the memories came flooding back. Emma's birth mother had been a distant cousin of Luke's, someone who had struggled with health issues her whole life. We had agreed to take Emma in when she was just a baby, but we had never dug too deeply into her family history. Now, I couldn't help but wonder, could the anomaly in Emma's DNA be tied to her birth parents? And if so, what did it mean for her future? The realization hit me like a lightning strike. Emma wasn't biologically mine or Luke's. She was adopted. For years, that fact had been so seamlessly woven into our family that I rarely thought about it. But now, with the DNA test results raising more questions than answers, it was impossible to ignore. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching Emma's adoption papers like a lifeline. My mind raced back to the day we brought her home, how Luke and I had promised to give her the kind of love and stability her birth mother couldn't provide. And we had. Or at least, I thought we had. But now, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I broached the subject with Luke. He looked up from his coffee, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and wariness. We'd been avoiding each other since the DNA test results, both of us unwilling to face the tangled mess of emotions between us. "We need to talk about Emma," I said, sliding the adoption papers across the table. Luke frowned as he picked them up. "What about her?" "The DNA test," I said carefully. "It didn't give us a clear answer because, she's not biologically ours." Luke froze, the papers halfway to the table. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath. "You remember her birth mother? Your cousin, Rachel?" Luke's brow furrowed as he set the papers down. "Of course, I remember Rachel. But what does that have to do with anything? She had health issues, right?" I said, trying to piece my thoughts together. We never really looked into her family history, but what if there's something genetic going on? Something that explains the DNA anomaly. Luke leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You think Rachel's family history could be the reason? It's possible, I said. But if we want answers, we'll need to start digging. Over the next few days, I dove headfirst into researching Rachel's family. Luke was hesitant at first, but eventually, he joined me. We spent hours combing through old family photos, letters, and medical records, trying to piece together the puzzle. What we found was troubling. Rachel's mother, Lucille, had died young from a mysterious illness. Her father had been absent for most of her life, and her siblings, Emma's aunts and uncles, had scattered across the country, leaving few traces behind. The more we dug, the more it seemed like Rachel's family had been hiding something. And then, I found it, a handwritten letter tucked into the back of one of Rachel's old photo albums. It was addressed to her from her father, and it was dated a year before Emma was born. The letter was short but chilling. Rachel, I know I haven't been the father you needed, and I'm sorry for that. But there's something you need to know. Our family carries a rare condition, something that's been passed down for generations. It doesn't always show up, but when it does, it's serious. Please, if you have children, make sure they're tested. Don't let them grow up in the dark like I did. The letter was unsigned, but it sent a shiver down my spine. What was this rare condition? And could it explain the anomaly in Emma's DNA? As Luke and I grappled with the implications of the letter, I received an unexpected phone call. Dylan. Hey, he said, his voice tentative. I was thinking about Emma's test results, and I did some digging of my own. Digging? I asked, surprised. What do you mean? I reached out to a geneticist I know, Dylan said. He reviewed the lab's findings, and he thinks Emma might have something called mosaicism. It's rare, but it could explain why her DNA test was inconclusive. Mosaicism? I repeated, the word unfamiliar and heavy on my tongue. It's when someone has two different sets of DNA, Dylan explained. It can happen for a lot of reasons, sometimes during development, sometimes because of a condition. But if that's the case, it could change everything. Armed with this new information, Luke and I decided to take Emma to a genetic specialist. It was a delicate process, explaining to her why we needed to do more tests without raising too many questions. Emma was perceptive, though, and I could tell she sensed that something wasn't quite right. At the clinic, the specialist ran a series of tests, including more detailed DNA analysis. The waiting was excruciating, every day stretching into an eternity as Luke and I tried to hold our fragile family together. When the results finally came back, they confirmed Dylan's theory: Emma had mosaicism. The specialist explained that Emma's condition likely stemmed from her birth mother's genetic history. But there was something else, a finding buried deep in the report that caught Luke's attention. Look at this, he said, pointing to the page. This marker here. It doesn't match Rachel's family history. I frowned, leaning closer. What do you mean? Luke turned to the specialist. Are you saying Rachel wasn't Emma's biological mother? The room fell silent as the specialist hesitated. It's highly unusual, but yes, it appears that Emma's biological mother wasn't Rachel. She must have been carrying someone else's child. The revelation left me reeling. If Rachel wasn't Emma's biological mother, then who was? And why hadn't Rachel said anything before she gave Emma up for adoption? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Luke and I left the clinic in stunned silence, our minds spinning with the implications. Dylan called that evening, asking for updates, and when I told him what we'd learned, he was just as shocked. This doesn't make sense, he said. Why would Rachel lie about being Emma's mother? I don't know, I said. But I'm going to find out. Over the next few weeks, Luke and I focused on unraveling the mystery of Emma's parentage. We tracked down old friends of Rachel's, former neighbors, anyone who might have answers. It wasn't easy. Rachel had passed away shortly after Emma's birth, and most of the people we spoke to hadn't seen her in years. But then, we found her best friend, a woman named Marcy. When we explained the situation to her, Marcy's face turned pale. Rachel never wanted anyone to know, she said, her voice shaking. She was scared of what people would think. Know what? I asked, leaning forward. Marcy hesitated, then took a deep breath. Rachel was a surrogate. Emma's biological parents weren't in the picture, so she decided to keep the baby. Marcy's revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud. A surrogate? The word felt foreign, out of place in the narrative of Emma's life. Luke and I sat across from her in her modest living room, the creak of the couch springs the only sound as the weight of her words settled over us. Rachel was a surrogate? Luke finally asked, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. For who? Marcy wrung her hands, glancing nervously between us. I don't know all the details, she admitted. Rachel wasn't exactly open about it. But I know she did it privately, no agencies or contracts. She told me she was helping out an old friend, someone who couldn't have children. I exchanged a glance with Luke. Did she ever mention who this friend was? I pressed. Marcy shook her head. No. She was scared people would judge her for keeping Emma after the parents, well, after they didn't stay in the picture. Why didn't they? Luke asked. I don't know, Marcy said. Rachel never said. But she was adamant that Emma was her responsibility after that. The drive home was silent, tension simmering between Luke and me. This new information had cracked open a door we hadn't even known was there, and beyond it was 100 more questions. Who were Emma's biological parents? Why had Rachel kept their secret? And what had happened to make them walk away? As we pulled into the driveway, Luke broke the silence. We need to find out who they are. I nodded. But how? Rachel's gone, and there's no paper trail. Even Marcy didn't know their names. Luke frowned, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. There has to be something. Rachel couldn't have done this completely off the grid. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. 2 days later, an answer came from an unlikely source, Dylan. I hadn't told him about Rachel's surrogacy yet, mostly because I was still trying to process it myself. But Dylan had a way of prying information out of me, and during one of our late-night phone calls, I finally spilled the truth. Rachel was a surrogate, he repeated, his voice incredulous. For who? We don't know, I admitted. That's what we're trying to figure out. There was a long pause on the line. Then, Dylan said something that made my heart stop. I think I might know someone who can help. The next day, Dylan introduced us to a private investigator named Eric. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man with a knack for digging up buried secrets. After we explained the situation, he leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard thoughtfully. So, you're looking for the biological parents of your adopted daughter, he said, summarizing our convoluted story with surprising ease. And all you've got is the name of the surrogate and a vague timeline. That's about it, Luke said. Eric nodded. It's not much, but it's a start. If Rachel was in contact with these parents, there's probably some kind of record. Emails, letters, phone calls. People are bad at covering their tracks. And if they're not? I asked. Eric smirked. Then we dig deeper. Eric wasted no time. Over the next few weeks, he combed through Rachel's old phone records, email accounts, and even her social media history. It was slow, painstaking work, and for a while, it seemed like we were chasing shadows. Then, one afternoon, Eric called with a breakthrough. I found something, he said, his voice crackling through the phone. An old email thread from Rachel's account. She was corresponding with someone named A.S. about the surrogacy. A.S. I repeated. That's it? No full name? Not yet, Eric said. But there's more. The emails mention a medical facility, a fertility clinic in Chicago. If we can get access to their records, we might be able to track this person down. Luke and I made the trip to Chicago the following week. Dylan offered to come along, but Luke insisted it was something we needed to do on our own. The drive was tense, neither of us sure what we would find, or if we'd find anything at all. The clinic was tucked away in a nondescript office building, its sterile lobby a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions churning inside me. We presented the adoption papers and the details Eric had uncovered, hoping it would be enough to convince them to help. At first, the staff was hesitant. Privacy laws were a major hurdle, and they couldn't release any information without permission from the biological parents. But then, one of the nurses pulled us aside. "I can't give you names," she said, her voice low, "but I can tell you that the couple who worked with Rachel didn't finish their treatment here. They withdrew after a few months." "Why?" Luke asked. The nurse hesitated. "I don't know for sure, but there were complications." As we drove back to the hotel that night, my mind was racing. Complications? What did that mean? And why would it cause the biological parents to walk away from their child? Luke was silent for most of the drive, but as we pulled into the parking lot, he turned to me, his expression grim. "I think I know who AS might be." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Who?" Luke took a deep breath. "Avery. My old college roommate." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't thought about Avery in years, but now that Luke had said it, pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. Avery had struggled with infertility for years. Luke had mentioned it once or twice, back when we were newlyweds. But I had never imagined there could be a connection to Emma. Why would Avery work with Rachel? I asked, trying to make sense of it. They didn't even know each other. "I don't know," Luke admitted. "But I'm going to find out." The next morning, Luke called Avery. It had been years since they'd spoken, and the conversation was awkward at first. But when Luke mentioned Rachel's name, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I think we need to talk," Avery said finally. "In person." Avery agreed to meet us at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Chicago. Luke and I arrived early, the tension between us palpable. Neither of us knew what to expect. Avery had always been an enigmatic figure, charming, intelligent, but also deeply private. Luke had spoken about him in passing over the years, but they had drifted apart, as people often do. Now, the mention of Rachel's name had pulled him back into our lives like a ghost from the past. Avery arrived a few minutes late, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the cozy cafe. He spotted us immediately and approached the table with a hesitant smile. "Luke," he said, extending a hand. "It's been a long time." Luke stood and shook his hand, his expression unreadable. "Yeah. Too long." Avery's gaze shifted to me, and his smile faltered. "Caroline," he said with a polite nod. "I didn't expect to see you here." We ordered coffee, though none of us touched it. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable until Luke finally broke it. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "We're trying to figure out the truth about Emma's biological parents. Rachel's name came up in connection to a surrogacy. And so did yours." Avery's face hardened, and he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I was wondering when this might surface." "So, it's true?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You and Rachel, she carried Emma for you?" Avery hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Rachel was our surrogate." The story Avery told us was both shocking and heartbreaking. He and his partner at the time, a woman named Sophia, had struggled with infertility for years. After exhausting every option, they turned to Rachel, who agreed to carry their child. "Rachel was amazing," Avery said, his voice tinged with regret. She was selfless, kind, everything we could have hoped for. But things didn't go as planned. What happened? Luke asked. Avery sighed. Sophia was diagnosed with a rare illness shortly after Rachel got pregnant. It progressed quickly, and by the time Emma was born, Sophia was gone. My chest tightened as I imagined the pain Avery must have felt. But there was more to the story, I could see it in his eyes. I couldn't do it alone, Avery admitted, his voice breaking. I was grieving, barely holding it together. I thought Emma deserved better than a father who was falling apart. Rachel offered to take her in, and I agreed. I sat back in my chair, stunned. Emma's biological father had been in front of us this whole time. But he hadn't abandoned her out of indifference or selfishness. He had done it because he thought it was the best thing for her. Does she know? Avery asked, his eyes darting between Luke and me. I shook my head. No. We've never told her about the adoption. And we didn't know about you until now. Avery nodded slowly, his expression conflicted. I always wondered if I made the right choice. If I should have found a way to keep her. But now, he trailed off, his eyes misting. She's better off with you. The revelation brought some clarity, but it also raised new questions. What did this mean for Emma? Should we tell her about Avery? And if so, how? Luke and I debated for days, neither of us sure of the right path forward. Then, one evening, Luke made a decision. She deserves to know the truth, he said. We can't keep this from her forever. I nodded, though the thought of telling Emma terrified me. How would she react? Would she feel betrayed? Or would she embrace the truth? We sat Emma down one Sunday afternoon, the adoption papers and Avery's photo on the coffee table in front of us. My heart raced as I searched for the right words. Emma, I began, my voice shaking. There's something we need to tell you. Something we should have told you a long time ago. Emma frowned, her green eyes darting between us. What is it? Luke took over, his voice steadier than mine. You know how much we love you, right? How proud we are to be your parents. Emma nodded slowly, her expression wary. Well, Luke continued, when you were born, we adopted you. Your birth mother, Rachel, was a wonderful woman who wanted to give you the best life possible. And your biological father, he's someone we've just recently learned about. Emma's eyes widened. My biological father? I handed her the photo of Avery. She stared at it for a long moment, her face unreadable. Who is he? His name is Avery, I said. He's Rachel's cousin, and he cared about you very much. Emma didn't say much at first. She asked a few questions, about Rachel, about Avery, about why we hadn't told her sooner, but mostly, she just listened. Later that night, I found her sitting on her bed, staring at the photo of Avery. Are you okay? I asked gently. Emma looked up at me, her expression thoughtful. I don't know. It's a lot to take in. I nodded, sitting beside her. I know. And you don't have to figure it all out right now. We're here for you, no matter what. Emma leaned her head against my shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Avery expressed a desire to meet Emma, but we all agreed to take things slow. For now, Emma seemed content to process the truth on her own terms, and Luke and I were determined to support her every step of the way. But even as we worked to rebuild our family, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. There were still questions unanswered, still pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. And deep down, I knew that the past had a way of coming back when you least expected it. Life began to settle into a tentative rhythm in the weeks following our revelation to Emma. She was remarkably resilient, asking questions at her own pace and even expressing a cautious interest in meeting Avery. Luke and I, still navigating the fragile state of our marriage, focused on giving her the space she needed to process everything. But just when I thought we were finally turning a corner, another twist emerged, one I never saw coming. It was a crisp Saturday morning when the knock came at the door. Luke had taken Jack to soccer practice, and Emma was upstairs working on a school project. I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard it, 3 sharp knocks that seemed to echo louder than they should have. I opened the door to find a woman standing on the porch. She was in her mid-30s, with auburn hair pulled into a loose bun and sharp, probing eyes. She held a leather briefcase in one hand and a file folder in the other. "Caroline Foster?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. "Yes," I replied, a knot forming in my stomach. "My name is Laura Grant. I'm an attorney representing a party with a vested interest in Emma's welfare." My heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me? What are you talking about?" Laura's expression softened, but her tone remained professional. "May I come in? I think it's better if we discuss this privately." I led Laura into the kitchen, my mind racing. Once seated, she opened the file folder and slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a court document, stamped and signed. "My client, Sophia Langston's sister, is petitioning for parental rights to Emma," Laura said gently but firmly. I blinked, struggling to process her words. Sophia's sister. What does this have to do with her? Sophia named her sister, Lisa Langston, as a guardian in her will, Laura explained. She wasn't aware of the surrogacy arrangement when Rachel decided to keep Emma. But now that she's learned about it, Lisa feels strongly that she has a responsibility to Emma. My stomach churned. She feels strongly now. After 13 years? Laura hesitated. Lisa only recently learned about Emma's existence. She believes Sophia's wishes should be honored. When Luke came home later that day, I told him everything. He listened in stunned silence, his face growing darker with every word. "She can't just walk in and demand custody," he said, pacing the kitchen. "We're Emma's parents. Legally, emotionally, every way that matters." "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But if she has a valid claim through Sophia's will, this could get complicated." Luke's jaw tightened. "We won't let her take Emma. No matter what." Over the next few weeks, our lives became consumed by legal proceedings. Lisa's attorney argued that Emma had a right to know her biological family and that Sophia's wishes should be respected. Our attorney, a seasoned litigator named Dan, countered that Emma's best interests lay with the only family she'd ever known, us. The stress was overwhelming. Every time I looked at Emma, I felt a wave of guilt for appending her life. She didn't know about the court case yet, we were waiting for the right moment to tell her. But I could see the tension in Luke's shoulders, the worry in his eyes, and I knew the stakes were higher than ever. One afternoon, during a break in court proceedings, I ran into Laura outside the courthouse. She hesitated for a moment, then approached me. "Mrs. Foster," she said, her voice softer than it had been during our first meeting. "I wanted to tell you something, off the record." I frowned, wary but curious. "What is it?" Laura glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "Lisa's case, it's not as solid as it seems." "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated, then sighed. "Sophia's will does name Lisa as a guardian, but there's no provision for custody in the event of a surrogacy arrangement. It's a gray area, legally speaking." "Then why pursue it?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. "Why put Emma through this if there's no real claim?" Laura looked uncomfortable. "Lisa's motivations aren't entirely about Emma. She's trying to fulfill a promise to Sophia. But I'm not sure even she knows what's best for the child." Her words stayed with me long after she walked away. Eventually, the truth about the custody battle came out, though not in the way we'd hoped. Emma overheard Luke and me arguing one night and demanded to know what was going on. There was no way to sugarcoat it, so we told her everything. At first, she was quiet, her expression unreadable. Then, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Does she want to take me away from you?" she asked. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly. "No one is taking you away from us, Emma. We're going to fight this, no matter what." "But what if she wins?" Emma whispered. "She won't," Luke said firmly. "You're our daughter, Emma. Nothing changes that." As the custody battle dragged on, new evidence came to light, evidence that changed everything. Our attorney discovered a series of emails between Rachel and Lisa, sent shortly after Emma's birth. In them, Rachel explicitly stated her intent to raise Emma as her own and explained why she believed it was the best decision for the child. Lisa's response? Silence. She knew, Luke said, his voice shaking with anger. She knew Rachel planned to keep Emma, and she didn't do anything about it. The emails were a turning point in the case. Lisa's claims about being blindsided by Emma's existence suddenly seemed less credible. The court ruled in our favor, stating that Emma's well-being was best served by remaining with the family she'd known her entire life. In the aftermath of the court case, life slowly began to return to normal, or at least, a new version of normal. Emma met Avery, and while their relationship was tentative at first, it grew into something meaningful over time. Luke and I continued to work on our marriage, building trust brick by brick. As for Lisa, she disappeared from our lives as quickly as she had entered them. I didn't blame her for wanting to fulfill her sister's wishes, but I was relieved that she had finally let us be. Through it all, I learned one thing: families aren't defined by biology or paperwork. They're defined by love, by the people who show up day after day, no matter how messy or complicated life gets. And for better or worse, that was our family.